My name is Seb Rose. Some of you know me, some of you don't. And I would like to talk today about contrasting test automation and BDD. So there's a couple of warnings that come at the beginning of this session so that you can bail and leave if it doesn't fit your needs. It's been miscommunicated. So the first is, behavior-driven development is a technique for developing software that I am particularly engaged with. I come from the Cucumber organization, or at least I have a massive involvement with the Cucumber organization. And Cucumber is a tool that was created to support behavior-driven development. And behavior-driven development is an approach that works well in Agile organizations. So actually, I'm going to be talking contrasting test automation and behavior-driven development through the lens of Agile. And that's why I gave this one the subtitle about this is looking at this comparison from an interactions over tools perspective. And those of you who are familiar with the Agile manifesto might see the relevance of that. If not, we'll get to it shortly. So that's my first warning. I'm going to be talking about test automation and BDD from an Agile perspective. If you're not interested in Agile, this might be the wrong place for you. Second warning is that 90 minutes is a very long time for anyone to listen to any other person. So I have peppered this presentation with a couple of polls and a couple of exercises, which I will be asking you to participate in breakout rooms using the Miro online whiteboard. If you don't feel like participating, I can't force you, but if it will be significant chunks of this session, maybe 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and so you may want to move somewhere else if that doesn't fit your expectations. For those of you that have just joined, in this session, this is in a meeting format. I would be very happy if you would be prepared to turn on your videos. You can also turn on your sound, which will allow you to interrupt me as I talk if you have questions that you would like answered in the flow. So there will be a Q&A at the end, but actually it's often quite beneficial to be able to ask the questions at the very point that the question arises. So with those warnings out of the way, let's get started. I'm going to give a pitch at the beginning about why I think it's worth looking at things from an interaction perspective rather than a tool perspective. I'm going to talk about my definition of test automation and how I've seen that applied in many organizations. Then switch the lens to behavior-driven development. At that point, I would like to do some compare and contrast. There's going to be an exploration, a sort of diversion into shift left, which is something that some of you may have heard of. If not, you will learn about it. And then finally, what I would like to do is try and dispel the confusion that it definitely exists across the internet that when test automation and behavior-driven development are compared. So without further ado, first poll. So the first poll is just about where you are right now. It's for me to get a perspective on whether any of you are working in an environment that where behavior-driven development is being used. It's not pertinent particularly to this to the talk, but what I'm going to use it as a data point for myself. And there's another poll at the end to try and track whether the information that I have given you changes your response. So I think we're almost there. I'll give it another 10 seconds. And then, is that okay? We're done. Cool. So let's show the results. The results are that half of you don't use BDD, and are fairly sure about that. A few of you don't know what BDD is, and hopefully by the end of this session, you will have some idea of it. And 6 of you, which is about a third, in fact, exactly a third, occasionally think you use BDD, or some of you use BDD. So that's really interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, so then let us move on to the interactions over tool. Whoops, too many clicks. So the first thing is that some people get exercised about why I even care about the confusion between test automation and BDD. There are also people who get upset about the distinctions or differentiation between TDD, ATDD, which is acceptance test-driven development, and specification by example. And I think that the issue here is that names are really important. So when we talk about something, when we discuss things among ourselves, if we are ambiguous about it, if people can misunderstand what you're saying, they will. So it's really critical to ensure that when we use a name for something, we're using it in a way that is, well, canonical. That's the ideal anyway. The image here is of a book by Ursula Le Guin, and many of you, I am sure, are aware of her Wizard of Earthsea trilogy in 5 parts, where where the rule of names is used in her depiction of the magic system that's used in that environment. And in that point, if you have the true name of something, then you can control it. Both test automation and BDD appear not to have a true name, as they're both very difficult to control how people interpret them. And I think as developers, and I'm guessing here that many of us come from if we aren't developers, we come from a development background. Naming is something that is, really crucial throughout architecture, design, and implementation. And there's a brilliant series of articles by Arlo Belshi where he posited the 7 stages of naming, and essentially underpins the importance of getting names right, but also the fact that you don't necessarily get them right in the first place. You evolve towards a common understanding of those names. You refine those names. You build domain languages and ubiquitous languages that help effectively catalog the knowledge and the understanding of what you in your context are trying to achieve. So if you haven't read Arlo's articles, I commend them to you. If you have, then I hope that what I said made sense. Right at the beginning, I was warning you all that this session is seen through an Agile methodology lens, view from that viewpoint. But the elephant in the room is that actually even Agile is not well understood. There is no canonical meaning. The Agile community is beset with rifts and arguments about what agility means, from all the way from the soft, dare I say it, tree huggy type Agile mindset folk, through to the hardcore, well, actually, it's just rock with another name of safe and dad and things like that. So there's a huge spectrum of people that work in the Agile space. And the only thing about the Agile space that anyone can really agree on is that it was all kicked off by the Agile Manifesto. However, the Agile Manifesto says very little in it. It's got the 4 principles and the 12 values, and they aren't. There's nothing about them that is prescriptive. Even the principles are talking about one thing is more important than another. So Agile itself is open to interpretation. So it's not a great example of canonical naming, although we can point back to the manifesto at least to say this is what defined Agile at its inception, or at the inception of its name, and we can go back there to compare things that we are doing against that manifesto to see whether they do in fact conform. And one of the principles is that we've come to value in the Agile Manifesto, that is that we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So this perspective is important, and this perspective is particularly important in this discussion about test automation and behavior-driven development, because the most famous or well-known component of behavior-driven development is this automation tool called Cucumber. And there are many people in the world who conflate cucumber with behavior-driven development. We'll talk about that a little bit further as we go down, but really the point I want to, what I'll be emphasizing as we go through the session today is that it's the individuals and interactions that are more important to differentiating test automation and BDD rather than the tools that are being used. Does anyone have any comments or questions as at this point? Okay. So I'm going to dive into test automation. Now, my guess is that there's not a lot of mystery to people on this call. You know, testing is something that everyone that works in software development is at least aware of. One would hope that everyone who's involved in software development also does some form of testing, but at least I hope we'll all be aware of it. And automation, well, that means that it's not manual, right? So people are going to do things, the tests are going to be automated and run without human intervention, hopefully. There isn't, again, a great canonical definition of automation. I pulled this one from Wikipedia. So test automation is the use of software separate from the software being tested to control the execution of tests and the comparison of actual outcomes with predicted outcomes. So this is a reasonable, this seems like common sense, right? There's nothing in here that's particularly contentious. I think the only bit that we might explore as we go through the day, through the session, is whether test automation is only about testing software. But with that aside, this is not a definition that I have a huge amount of argument with. It's a very general, very broad definition, and unless someone in this session suggests otherwise, I think we can live with it as a definition for test automation. And test automation is being sought high and being sought low throughout the industry. Test automation is a goal. You know, you see whole departments driven by this desire to have greater amount of test automation, and the reason for this is because there are perceived benefits. I say perceived benefits because in my experience, test automation doesn't always deliver the benefits that people hope for or are expecting. So the first clear, obvious benefit that people might expect to get from test automation is faster feedback, right? So if you've got a bundle of a whole team of manual testers and you want to get feedback on whether the most recent change to the code that you've made has affected it, it might take days, it might take weeks, it might take months to run through a manual regression pack. The intention or the hope with automated tests is that you can kick them off on demand. These days with CI pipelines and containers and cloud services, you may even be able to scale them in parallel and do lots of tests all at the same time. So this faster feedback is a significant benefit that people are looking for from test automation. But it's not just faster feedback, they're also looking for more frequent feedback. So in my experience, you know, I've worked on products in the past where you make changes, you might make changes for a whole quarter, and then you might have a 6-week period while your manual test team is stood up, and you get feedback on your last 3 months' work in a 6-week period. And that's, you know, obviously that's not a great way of being able to react in an agile fashion to issues and problems that are arising. So the fact that you can automate the tests means you get faster feedback because they're not needing lots of manual hands on keyboards, and because they are spinnable up on demand without needing to allocate resources, then you should be able to run them more frequently. So those are two very tangible benefits that people are looking for from test automation. There are other benefits that teams and organizations expect. One is higher quality. Now, we'll look at some of the challenges to this in a minute. I'm not convinced that test automation necessarily gives higher quality. I'm not even convinced that it generally leads to higher quality products. Another benefit is that it's repeatability. So if you have hands-on keyboards running through manual test scripts, there may be variability in the way the tests are run, depending on which tester is running them, or the particular test run, or their focus at the time. So that is touted as a benefit. I actually wonder whether repeatability is a benefit, and it's actually one of the things that I would like to ask you folks to consider when we go into the breakout rooms. And then the final benefit that I'd like to identify is lower costs. Because you have automated tests that can be spun up on demand, they don't need large numbers of people running them for you, because you can spin up environments in parallel potentially, and therefore get the results very quickly. Well, maybe we can have fewer testers, and therefore we can lower costs. I'd also like to question this one. In my experience, I've seen test automation increase costs. Your experiences may be different, but in some banks that I've worked with, they have teams, not just one team, but several teams that their entire job appears to be they come in the morning and fix the automated tests that broke the night before. No, I say fix the tests. So the tests are so brittle that they just keep on breaking. It's a millstone over their development process. So I am in just a second going to put you into breakout rooms for the first time. Does anyone have any questions on what we've discussed, what I've talked about so far?
Hi, Seb. Yes, I have a question regarding higher quality. So when you mentioned higher quality, do you mean less bugs make it to production, or did you mean something else?
No, I did mean that. Yes. So you're right. There are other quality aspects as well, but typically the metrics that people are looking for is fewer customer-related bugs, and in fact fewer bugs in general, even within Sprint. So these benefits are potentially deliverable, and yet you have all managed to maybe not fill up the boards with negatives, but at least find certain areas where those benefits may not be realized. And I'd like to dig into the high level reasons that these benefits are not achieved in many of the organizations that I've worked with. So it was Andrew, you've already talked about this, but it's absolutely critical to understand that automation is a software development task. There has been and continues to be a huge effort from tool vendors to provide tools that can help us transition manual testers, i.e. testers that don't have development skills and development experience, into the test automation space. And there's a hope that one day that will succeed. But so far, my personal opinion is that it has failed, and it has failed miserably by increasing costs, increasing unhappiness among the testers that are forced to adopt these tools that they are not truly familiar with. And so we have test automation teams who need to have skills that actually are not, they're not common in the marketplace. We've begun to see in places like Silicon Valley and the bleeding edge, the SDETs, the developers in tests, the test automation engineers who have both testing knowledge and development skills, but they are still relatively a rare breed. So finding people that have those skills is still hard. And that's one of the challenges, because if you don't have people with the correct skills, you will not end up with a test automation suite that is valuable and useful to the organization, and it will become a drag and either get binned because it's too costly to maintain, or will soak up large amounts of resources, i.e. money. Another challenge is that actually if we think about test automation as something done by testers or by a test automation team, then testability is not something that is thought about by developers while they're developing the code, which makes it really hard to write automated tests that will actually exercise those areas of the code base that are susceptible to defects, by all of it. But so if we think just about dates, right? If you are thinking about how various dates might affect your system, then you're going to want to have a way of setting dates in the calendar. So for instance, if you've got an interest rate rise coming up in a certain time, you want to make sure that the calculations get applied in the correct way at the correct point in time. Unless that's thought about while the developers are developing it, maybe they will just check the system clock. Now, I'm sure we all have opinions about that. My personal experience is working in a bank where to do the testing, the test team had to spin up the software on separate hardware and set the system clock forward, right? This is not a great way of writing automated tests. The whole thought about how are we going to write tests that exercise different parts of the system with different contexts isn't considered by the development team, because they're trying to satisfy the needs of the requirements. Until we bring test automation and developers together, I think testability is going to force an awful lot of test automation to testing around the outside on full stacks of production code. And that leads to enhanced fragility in the tests. Oh, enhanced is the wrong way of putting it. Over fragile tests that take too long because you continually have to go from login all the way through to the database and wait for things to happen. So the testability of the actual software itself, i.e. designed for testability, is a challenge to getting these benefits from test automation. And anyone who's played with the record and playback tools that are provided by Selenium, etc., will know that it looks like you're going to get cheap benefits that can be maintained and developed by non-development people without development skills. But in reality, you end up with fragile tests and extra costs. Test automation as an activity that happens that happens in a test automation team by testers after the software is developed doesn't just affect the testability of the software itself, but it actually leads to late feedback. Earlier on, I talked about the 3-month development cycle with a 6-week test cycle at the end of it. That's really late feedback. But even if you're working in a 2-weekly sprint, if what happens is that the development team and maybe an on-team tester works with the code for the 2-week sprint, but then it goes to a test automation team after that in a subsequent sprint, then you're going to be getting feedback about defects reported after the sprint is finished, and that will require either scheduling it for a subsequent sprint or prioritizing the work in the sprint, in the iteration that you're currently in. And that itself leads to context switches, which is not an efficient way of using anybody's time. In case you're wondering, the image here is of a piece of burnt toast, and this is a nod to Edward Deming, whose my favorite quote of his was, "Let's make toast the American way. You burn it, I'll scrape it." And that was him talking about the fact that we just the manufacturing systems of the time didn't build quality into the production line. What they did was they waited until the car popped out the end, and then they checked it. And the problem with that is that then you have a lot of inventory that is not shippable and needs to be go back and be fixed. And that's exactly what software organizations do when they have a separate test automation team from the development team. The development team burns the toast, and then the test automation is supposed to identify the fact that toast is burnt, and it goes back to be scraped by the development team in a later iteration. And then finally, I managed to squeeze in an image from one of my favorite movies, which is Kelly's Heroes. I don't know if many of you've watched Kelly's Heroes, but it's a war movie from that era of Telly Savalas and Clint Eastwood. And in this particular scene, the Kelly's heroes get stuck in a minefield, and they need to get out, and they find out where the mines are by laboriously prodding in front of themselves with their bayonets to see if there's something hard and metal in front of them. And when the first person gets to the edge of the field, everyone can follow his path. And so what people do is they prod to try and get to the path that's known to be clear, and then they keep everyone further back in the field just follows that path. You might find that this is a torturous analogy, but that's what test automation is. It's us defining a path, and we just follow that path over and over again. And if we get that green light that all the tests have passed, we are tempted to believe that that means that we don't have any defects in the system. We get overconfidence from getting those tests passing. Now, I'm not suggesting that this was the wrong approach for this platoon in a minefield. I think it was the right approach. But for testers trying to test software, the idea of always running down the same paths, putting in the same data, is unlikely to uncover new defects. It will pick up regressions, some regressions, but it won't pick up all regressions, and it won't pick up defects that weren't thought about when the automated tests were written. So the challenge is that test automation actually doesn't always lead to higher quality, because we think that we're getting quality because the tests are on green, but in fact, in the end, the quality is questionable. So the interactions that go on in my in the organizations that I have seen. So this is I have more to say when we talk about BDD, but within the test automation space, this is a generalized, abbreviated process. So what I've seen in organizations is that something called the business comes up with some requirements, which gets passed to maybe architecture or design or team lead or a tiger squad. They come up with a specification which gets passed to development testing, the development and test team, and also the test automation team. In reality, it normally goes to the development test team first and the test automation team somewhat later, but this is even idealized. Then development and test, so your Scrum teams or your Agile teams work on the specification, and at some point they go, right, this is done, this story is done, this part is done. They pass it over to test automation, and test automation invariably find that something's not right. Now, this might be because they have misunderstood the specification, i.e., test automation team and the development team have a different understanding of the specification. But it might just be that the automated tests have found a defect and it needs to be fixed. And this normally happens not in the same iteration, and so it goes round and round, and frequently it goes round multiple times. Now, having gone round multiple times, there's normally something left that's not fixed, and essentially the risk is then passed on to the business. Is it good enough for us to release? This is not a canonical process. This is, as I said, this is just my experience. I'm trying to give a high-level overview of the sort of interactions that happen. There's not a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of handoffs. There's a flow. It can be defined and gated, but it's not where people are working together. This may not be your experience, and I hope it isn't, but this is a typical way that organizations, large and small, continue to work in the software development area. Behavior-driven development is, as I said right at the beginning, my area of interest and my area of expertise. So let's talk about it. BDD has historically been hard to pin down. There is no canonical definition, and there's not, if you look in Wikipedia, there's not even a great definition there that I can pinch. So this is the definition that I use in my classes and my training. And here what we have is we have a loop. We start off with a user story, and each user story goes through 3 core practices of behavior-driven development, which we've called discovery, formulation, and automation. In discovery, the team collaboratively arrives at a shared understanding of the requirements of that user story. So not the whole product, not the whole feature, not the whole release, just the current user story that's under discussion. And we typically use an approach called example mapping, which was developed by my colleague Matt Wynn, which is hugely powerful, really wonderful. And if you're in any way interested, I'll be talking about it in a 20-minute session this afternoon. And the output of the discovery session on the story is rules, which are basically the specifications, the requirements that need to be implemented for that user story to be delivered, and concrete examples of how those rules would behave in the system, which can be used as the basis of test cases, whether automated or otherwise. But then take those examples through the practice of formulation and capture them in business readable terminology. So this is where tests truly do become documentation of the system, because there's a defined practice which takes the random thoughts about how the system needs to be configured and describes them in business terminology. And finally, you can then begin to think about using tools such as Cucumber or SpecFlow or many of the others that exist that can read those business readable specifications and run automated code in response to them. And this generates something that we call living documentation, because unlike the documentation that we've got used to over the past 40 years, it actually self-verifies against the software that is currently deployed, or at least currently under development. And therefore, when the documentation, specification, and the implementation diverge, it manifests as a failing test, and you get notified. And therefore, you get the opportunity to either fix any defects that were introduced in the code or update the documentation if indeed it was the documentation that was out of date. The benefits or purported benefits are early learning, because you take each user story into a discovery session and collaboratively dig into the underlying requirements and the detailed underlying requirements before you write any code, because working software is right at the end of this loop. You learn early about if there are misunderstandings, if there are assumptions that the business had that were unfounded, if there are technical challenges that can't be overcome. It's just a really great way of de-risking before we actually commit large amounts of effort into developing code, test scripts, automation, etc. That shared understanding is valuable all the way through the BDD process of discovery, formulation, and automation, but also when you get into developing software. So there's a common misunderstanding among non-software professionals that development's just development, right? You can take any old developer, if they know the language and they can read some code, you can just dump them into a team and they can immediately deliver value. Well, there are some people like that in the world, but actually having some business domain knowledge is, pretty critical to developing and delivering quality software that delivers what the customer wants, but is also suitable for enhancement and maintenance over the coming 15 or 20 years that the software may exist. You get really fast feedback in BDD because you start getting feedback right at the discovery process, the discovery practice. As soon as you start asking questions, you have your testers and your developers asking questions of your product owner, your business analyst, you're immediately getting feedback about what might be expensive, what might be difficult, whether there are edge cases that haven't been thought about yet. Anyone who's received a 600-page requirement document knows that there are gaps in it. Tom Gilb has spoken a number of times at the Accu conference, and the work that he did at the European Space Agency on their requirements, he suggested that on an average A4 page of requirement specifications, there are 50 defects. that's a lot of issues that can be, that will only be uncovered later. You get living documentation if you follow the 3 practices of BDD. So documentation that is actually verifiable and correct and up to date. The high quality is actually much more likely to be achievable, because if you're following a behavior-driven approach, you will automate the automation before you write the code. So that will lead you to create code architectures that are testable. It will give you the ability to again see all the other benefits that potentially come from test automation are available or are implemented and delivered by behavior-driven development. But the fact that behavior-driven development, much like test-driven development, force us to think about design while we're doing the automation, rather than think about automation after we've done the implementation, does tend to deliver higher quality code with more, which is more amenable to testing. And consequently, because we get learning earlier, because we have got higher quality code, we hope that we will get lower costs. So quite a few of these benefits, so higher quality and lower costs and faster feedback, those were also in the benefits that we discussed around test automation. My contention is that you're still more likely to get them from BDD than you are from test automation without BDD or TDD. But that is obviously a matter that we should discuss maybe later. However, getting these benefits from behavior-driven development are also susceptible to significant challenges. And in fact, there are very few organizations in the world that have adopted behavior-driven development in a significant way and demonstrated the value that they've got from it. And the challenges are significant. So the first is that it requires a change in working practices, right? So we saw the interactions that we had in test automation. We've got business, we've got architecture and design, we got development and test, which is a slight change from development, separate from test, and we've got test automation teams. BDD is far more insistent about collaboration in the early phases of understanding the detailed requirements. There's no gated process where documents are handed over. The actual specification is crafted collaboratively, and the discovery sessions require much more interaction between product owners or business analysts and development and test personnel on the team as well. This is really hard in a lot of organizations. You know, product owners are forever going out speaking to customers. Equally, many product owners are product owners in name only. They're really just business analysts with a product owner title. Business analysts themselves don't often enjoy the detailed work with their technical or the development and test personnel that they work with, because behavior-driven development and that discovery practice encourages, you know, really detailed questioning. It's not confrontational, but it requires the developers and the testers to really think inside what they're being asked to do, come up with concrete examples of how it might behave, and then have the BA or product owner either say, yeah, that's how I want it to behave, or no, it should behave like this. Or quite often, and this is the bit that's really hard, is, I hadn't thought of that. So we move from a sort of a hierarchy to a much more flat structure where everybody contributes to the success of a software product in an equal way. And there's no pecking order of the tester's less important than the developer and the developer's less important than the business analyst. There's also, despite the fact that behavior-driven development has been around for over a decade now, the tooling is remarkably immature. So right at the beginning of this session, I talked about Cucumber and how Cucumber often got conflated with BDD, because that's how it came to be created. Cucumber is still probably, Cucumber and its brethren are still probably the most mature part of the BDD tooling infrastructure. So around the discovery process, it's really hard to implement that. There's no integrated system at the moment that goes from a backlog through to the living documentation that BDD offers as its output. There are a number of sort of halfway houses. So Jira can assist in this way. There are some Jira plugins like Behave Pro, which allow you to do some work in this area within the Jira space. My own company, SmartBear, is working on a tool called Cucumber Studio, which is working towards delivering an integrated workbench where you can start off with the discovery and follow all the way through in a single tool chain to get the results in the living documentation that are business readable. But in general, most organizations are only using Cucumber and the feature files that drive it, so the documentation that is living, that is written in business language, are all kept in source control, which is not a great place to allow product owners or customers or business analysts to access it. They probably don't want to go into your source control system, and many developers don't want them to be in there. So the shortcut at the moment is Cucumber and tools like that generate reports in HTML, which can then be published on wikis. But this is all, quite. It's not a mature way of working. There's no single customer view or portal to work through this practice, and so that's a challenge to adopting BDD in most organizations. And the final challenge is that BDD is really focused on the functional behavior of the system. It doesn't typically lend itself well to load testing or performance testing or penetration testing or usability testing. And so the changing in working practices takes quite a large involvement. The absence of immature tooling means that organizations have to build their own workflows, which takes another investment. And then at the end of it, you've still got to do a lot of the old testing that you used to do anyway. So it's a real hard sell. Might sound like I'm whining, and I guess I am. It's a really hard sell because in the companies that have adopted it, they've seen transformational changes and benefits. The interactions that go around with BDD, myself and Gashper Nodge wrote a book a couple of years ago called Discovery, where we laid out this idealized BDD workflow. I extracted it, and it's available on LinkedIn as a blog post. The link's down the right-hand side of this slide. But essentially what we have is we've got simplified down to an 8-step process where the business, here probably the product owner, if you're working in a Scrum team, picks the next most important user story. So this is the prioritization. That goes into discovery, where essentially business, architecture, design, development, test all collaborate on trying to ensure that they really understand the requirements of that particular story. Example mapping is the technique that I mentioned earlier. There's a great blog post by Matt Wynn on the cucumber.io website about that. The output of this requirement workshop, at the output of discovery, is a set of the requirements or rules that govern the scope of that specific user story, and for each rule, a set of examples that concretely demonstrate how that rule will behave once it's been implemented. That then gets translated into business terminology. Typically, the translation is done by a developer and a tester as a pair, and will then be reviewed by the rest of the team, hopefully everybody in the team, but definitely by the product owner, to ensure that the shared knowledge that was created during the requirement discovery has actually lodged. So it's a bit like teaching a language to, foreign language to somebody. So a native speaker will try and teach the foreign language to someone who doesn't speak that language natively. And then to ensure that they have learned something, you have a conversation. You make sure that when the person learning the language says something, it sounds right. You know, that they use the syntax correctly, they use the grammar correctly, they've got the vocab right. And so this review, which is done by the whole team, but especially by the product owner, is a sort of feedback mechanism to ensure that this pouring of knowledge from the customer through the product owner and the business analyst down into the development team has been effectively managed and delivered. At that point, we've got this business language specification. So it's the concrete examples that have been converted into the specifications, the scenarios, as they're called in Gherkin, which is the structure that Cucumber understands. And we will then get the development team to automate those examples. And this is the first point that we actually start imagining what the implementation of the production code should look like, because it's here that we know what we want the behavior to be, but we have to think about, are we going to try and exercise this? Are we going to automate it through the UI, through a service interface? Are we going to automate it directly with a component or with a class? We begin to design and write the code that we would like to exist. And it may not yet exist. And that's where we drop into a TDD loop of implementation, where we start on a much lower level, potentially writing failing micro specifications, programmer tests, and then going through the red-green refactor cycle that many of you will be familiar with. At some point, as you see, there's this loop that comes back out. You go back, and once you've finished implementing a particular scenario, you pop back and you formulate the next one. And so we've got a continual sausage factory pipeline of user stories and scenarios that will drive out their implementation coming through this BDD, this BDD practice set of BDD practices. Of course, at some point, you've got enough to release, or a story is complete and you want to do an interim release, or maybe you're bundling up a sprint's worth of work. And there's other tests that need to be done. So we still have to do exploratory testing, penetration testing, load testing, usability testing, and the like. What I'm trying to indicate here is that a lot of this, or at least some of this, can be done at the same time as development is taking place. Some of it is easier done afterwards. And there are obviously potential late feedback issues here as well. And then finally, we ship an increment. And 90 minutes goes very fast. Sorry, yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have a couple of questions
Sure.
on the previous part. So the pipeline you just described works on the user story level, but what about situations where the QA teams work on the feature level and aren't necessarily exposed to like this 2-week sprint planning and don't work on that low level of like user stories? How do you think we can integrate such teams to the BDD process?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to a greater extent, this plays back to the challenge that I posed in the previous slide about change of working practices. So this idea that there's a feature level that's somehow outside of the development cycle strikes me as something that's somewhat problematic. Now, I understand that there are huge organizations where we have different teams working with different components, and there is another process outside of this. The book that myself and Gaspar have just released, which is called Formulation, talks about a different form of scenario to the ones that we're describing here. So the scenarios that are created in step number 3 here, the formulate step, are illustrative scenarios. So their intention is to illustrate specific rules that govern the scope of a story. But beyond that, we understand and we understand the need for and have seen the value of a small number of journey scenarios that describe core user journeys through the system. Now, what we have found in our experience is that these are generally best created afterwards by a team such as what you're talking about, that is looking at across how the components interact. We don't use them as a way of driving out the architecture as such. But the challenge that I've seen in the organizations that I've worked with is that once you've spun up a team to create journey scenarios to try and do that, if you have a dedicated team for that, you can end up with too many of these journey scenarios. So there's the challenge is that we have an embedded set of people with a whole career's worth of experience of trying to test everything after it's been delivered. And so they're trying to do vast amounts of coverage with end-to-end tests. And I'm a big believer that end-to-end tests should be frugally used, as little as possible. Now, I know that that is contentious in a lot of circles. So those journey scenarios, I actually think the journey scenario itself, the core user journeys should be defined by the product team, and that they can be automated by the development teams at the end of a sprint or at the end of a series of sprints when they believe that functionality has been delivered. The trouble about having a separate QA team writing journey scenarios is, well, then they're tasked with writing the journey scenarios, and they'll be marked and measured on how many journey scenarios they create. And those journey scenarios, in my opinion, are of limited value. Yeah. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's just also another question. So when describing the pros of BDD, for me, the lines between like BDD and TDD were becoming more blurred because from what I've seen, the advantages you've described are a lot common with the advantages of like having tests before starting with implementation.
Yeah.
So just wanted to check that if I understood this correctly. So the main difference between like BDD and TDD is that like TDD can work on like minor specification, like on the smaller scale, while BDD on the bigger scale. Is that correct?
So that's a good way of describing it. However, actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Freeman and Price's book of the early noughties called "Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests." They do. They implement this double loop using JUnit in their book. So BDD and TDD are very similar, right? They, as you've identified. The difference for me is that the structure of a test written in BDD, so the output of this formulation, is business readable, and the functionality or the level of detail that you should try and capture using these business readable scenarios should be of interest to the business, right? We want them to read them and give us feedback. Whereas as developers, we know that underneath each of those useful business-facing pieces of behaviors that the system exhibits, there's tedious little, how do we handle these exceptions? What happens when there's a null pointer here, or how, if the database or if the file system fills up? So there's lots of things that are more suitable for testing or for developing out of sight of our BAs without the extra overhead of trying to find a business readable language. And so from my perspective, BDD and TDD are more about who's going to be interested in the level of detail that test or that specification deals with. Is it business facing, or is it really implementation focused?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's clear to tell from. Thanks.
So I have run out of time already. So I've obviously been speaking too much. I'm going to quickly go through compare and contrast. I'm afraid I'm going to jump shift left. The slides will be available, and I'm happy to answer questions. And then the confusion will wrap up. So quick comparison of BDD and test automation. So the basic main takeaway here is that BDD is a collaborative activity that starts early in the process and ensures and insists that automation happens before coding is done and is done by or at least with the developers. Whereas typically test automation is done either after or in parallel to coding. It's often siloed and it's often not business readable. There's an overlap because you can write automated business readable acceptance tests in JUnit or PyTest or whatever. The BDD approach insists on that. Test automation is a much more general thing and is more broadly adopted or more broadly usable. In the real world, I mean, I'm trying to give you a sense of the scale. I think there's far more organizations that use test automation than BDD. There's some overlap, but BDD is a vanishingly small proportion of the organizations, software development organizations use it. There's also a difference in the breadth of impact. So because test automation is such a general term, it applies in all the domains that I said BDD didn't apply in. So you can automate load testing, you can automate performance testing, you can automate to some extent security and penetration testing. However, behavior-driven development, although it's applicable mainly in the functional domain, has a much broader impact on an organization's outcome because it changes the way software is specified, designed and delivered. And it can have massive impact on the quality and the cost profile of that software. These circles, by the way, their size has no meaning. So I am going to jump through the confusion bit, the BDD, the shift left bit, because I just don't have time, I'm afraid. Oh, so many slides. There'll be another talk, maybe. So onto the confusion. Throughout the industry, people confuse and conflate BDD with test automation. And they do that because they conflate BDD with Cucumber. So I'm part of the organization that created Cucumber, that worked with Dan North and the creators of BDD to try and promote it. And inadvertently, we created a test automation tool that was so attractive that it became used by teams for test automation without any intention or desire for them to adopt BDD. And it's now become the point of going, well, if you use Cucumber, are you doing BDD? And the answer is, we don't know, because BDD is about the discovery, the formulation, the collaboration, the early learning, and Cucumber is simply a tool that understands business readable language and can run automation code in response to it. And that then takes us a step further. Cucumber understands this structured syntax called Gherkin. Gherkin uses the keywords given, when, then. And so then a lot of people reckon, if we write things out using given, when, then, we must be doing BDD. So there are programmer test frameworks that allow you to write JUnit tests using given, when, then. Does that mean you're doing BDD? Absolutely not. Behavior-driven approach is about driving the development of your software with from a shared understanding of what's required through collaboration between the business and the developers and the testers to generate business readable specifications that can be automated, rather than writing code and then generating test cases using given, when, then keywords. So this is, in my opinion, this is where the main misunderstanding about BDD being a testing technique creeps in. Of course, both BDD and test automation are looking for this goal of software automation, of delivering working software. And one of the pushbacks against adopting behavior-driven development is there's an overhead of writing these business readable specifications and automating them. And it's absolutely true that working software is more important than comprehensive documentation, but working software that is undocumented is a liability. Code, as I think it was Kevlin said, code's not an asset, it's a liability, but code that has no documentation is even more of a liability, right? Trying to go in and implement or enhance or fix a defect in code that has no documentation is a thankless and dangerous task. So whereas working software is the goal, some documentation is always valuable, and documentation that you can rely on, i.e. living documentation, is much more valuable than documentation that you can't rely on, because documentation that you can't rely on, well, you probably have to go look in the code anyway to check it, because you just can't rely on it. Testers are still valuable, so I'm going to skip over that. It's really important, but not much more to say about it. And then the wrap up. So a quick poll just to finish us off. I'm sorry, folks, that this has taken a little bit over the end. Could you please see whether, based on what we've talked about today, whether your team uses BDD or not? So I asked you at the beginning whether you thought they would say that they had, and now I'm asking you whether you believe that you have. Great, thank you. And so it's actually what I hoped for and what I expected. Maybe not what I hoped for, it's what I expected, which is that over the course of this session, fewer of you believe that your team, or at least few of you think that your team is doing BDD. Didn't actually ask you whether you believed it at the beginning. So now we're up to 75% say no. Thank you very much. So my takeaways for today. First takeaway, write shorter presentations or talk less. But test automation has more applicable domains than BDD. So I am not saying that test automation is a bad thing. I'm saying that it's a good thing, that it may not have the benefits that we think, but it's applicable in a very broad number of domains. But BDD has a broader impact on your organization. It will change the way your organization works should you choose to adopt it. And it can have a significant impact in the output, the outcomes for your software development teams. Given, when, then, gherkin, cucumber, these do not discriminate between, these are not the way of checking in your mind between, are we following a behavior-driven approach or are we just doing test automation? We really have to examine the discovery. Are you going through collaborative discovery and formulation? Test automation on its own does not help shift left. Well, we didn't go through the shift left one, so I'm afraid I'll just have to leave that one with you. Let's have a look at the slides at another time. But the final one is, it's not either or. So the best teams practice BDD and test automation. Behavior-driven development itself delivers some of your test automation goals, but there will be other automation areas that can be automated that deliver extra value. And I've talked about those a number of times. If you are trying to shift left, i.e. do some things earlier in the process, then BDD is going to help you way more than test automation. Test automation is just what it says on the tin. It automates tests, whereas behavior-driven development tries to get you to do much more learning early, and that then allows you to act on that before you have invested in code, in test scripts, and in other expensive activities that will be affected if the decisions were made incorrectly. Thank you for coming along. I believe that the right way I've been asked to do it is suggest that we either go to Discord or Remo to continue the discussion. Does anyone have any preferences? Or maybe you just want to go for lunch?
Discord seems a good way to me.
Okay, so let's go to Discord. I will have to go to find out which track I should be going on to, but I will see you in that track in Discord.